January 17th, 1991, in Baghdad, in a concrete-lined, air-conditioned bunker. Deep beneath the Iraqi capital, Soviet Air Defense Advisor Colonel Mikhail Surov stared at a bank of radar screens. The air was thick with the smell of stale cigarettes, ozone, and the quiet, pervasive hum of high-powered electronics. Surov was a man who believed in systems. He believed in layer defense. He believed in the brute mathematical certainty of Soviet-designed surface-to-air missile networks, and the network protecting Baghdad was a fortress. It was called carry a sophisticated semi-automated command and control system integrated by the French, but its teeth were pure Soviet steel. SA-2 guidelines, SA-3 goes mobile, SA-6. Gainful's backed by hundreds of conventional anti-aircraft guns. The entire web was linked, overlapping, and redundant. It was designed to repel a full-scale NATO assault. Its operators, trained by Surov and his colleagues, were on high alert. The sky over Baghdad was quiet. The P-18 Spoon rest long range. Warning radars swept the horizon, their green lines pulsing rhythmically, finding nothing. The French-made target acquisition radars were dark. The engagement radars for the missile batteries were cold. At 0251, the lights in the bunker flickered, a muffled thump, so deep it was felt more in the stomach than heard with the ears, vibrated through Surov's boots. A status board on the far wall lit up. Red. The Air Defense Sector Operations Center at Altari. Hit. Surov's eyes snapped to the radar scopes. Nothing. The Iraqi shift. Commander was shouting into a telephone, his voice tinny and sharp. Surov grabbed his own headset, bypassing the local command to get a direct feed from his own advisory team at the primary long-range radar station. Status? Surov barked in Russian. Nothing, Comrade Colonel. The voice came back strained. The sky is empty. Zero contact. It must be aground. Wait, another vibration. Stronger this time. The overhead lights failed, and for a terrifying half-second, the bunker was plunged into total darkness before the emergency. Batteries kicked in, bathing the room in a sickly red glow. 2 more lights on the status board went from green to red. A key telecommunications exchange in the city. The electrical power station. What is hitting us? Surov demanded. We do not. No. The voice on the other end shrieked. There is nothing there. The scopes are clean. This was the moment. The laws of physics, as Mikhail Surov understood them, began to dissolve. Jamming electronic warfare was one thing. You could see jamming. It appeared as noise, as snow, as false. Signals on the screen. A pilot would have to fight through it. But this was not noise. This was silence. This was absence. The screens were pristine. They showed an empty, peaceful sky. Yet from that empty sky, precision-guided, death was raining down on the most sensitive, most critical nerve centers of Baghdad's defense. A third series of impacts. This time, Surov recognized the coordinates, the air defense headquarters itself, above them. The Iraqi operators were panicking now, some abandoning their posts, others screaming into dead microphones. Surov watched, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of it. He was a veteran of the PVO, the Soviet Air Defense Forces. He had studied every American aircraft in meticulous detail. The B-52 was a lumbering giant visible from hundreds of kilometers away. The F-117 and F-16 were nimble fighters, but they would appear as clear, fast-moving blips. Even the F-17, the much-rumored American stealth fighter, was just a theory, a bogeyman. And besides, no technology was invisible. It was a law. Radar waves had to hit an object and bounce back. You could reduce the signal, but you could not erase it. Yet his equipment, billions of rubles worth of the best air defense technology the Soviet Union could export, insisted that nothing was flying over Baghdad, and the city itself, the fortress he had helped build, was being systematically, clinically dismembered target by target. The attacks were not random. They were not area bombing. This was a scalpel. The bombs were striking the precise ventilation shafts of command bunkers, the central nodes of fiber optic cables, the antennas of specific radar sites. This ghost knew exactly where they were. This complete and total failure of a system designed to be impenetrable was a terrifying mystery. The men in this bunker were witnesses to an impossible event, a new kind of warfare that defied their entire doctrine. If you want to understand the technology and the terror that define the final days of the Cold War, you're in the right place. Welcome to Cold War Impact. Click subscribe and let's investigate the mystery of the invisible bombers. For Colonel Surov and for the military attaché, furiously sending coded messages back to Moscow, the night of January 17th was not just a military defeat for their Iraqi allies. It was an existential nightmare. The stakes were not about Iraq. The stakes were about Moscow. The Baghdad carrier defense system was a direct, albeit simplified, export model of the PVO. Strany, the monolithic air defense shield protecting the Soviet Union itself. The same radars, the same missiles, the same operational philosophy. For 40 years, the entire Soviet military posture, the very concept of the motherland, was guaranteed by this shield. It was the iron wall that allowed their massive tank armies to function, the deterrent that ensured NATO bombers could never execute a successful first strike. And in a matter of minutes, this ghost had walked right through it. The reports filtering back to the Soviet General Staff in the hours and days that followed were not just contradictory. They were panicked. They read like pages from a science fiction novel. We are being attacked by an unseen enemy. Radar systems are 100% functional, but detect 0 inbound targets. Key nodes are being destroyed with pinpoint accuracy. The enemy possesses our exact coordinates. The Soviet Union's leadership was suddenly confronted with a horrifying technological gap, a gap they didn't even know existed. If the Americans possessed an invisible aircraft, what did that mean? It meant that the B-52s and the cruise missiles, the weapons they could see, were just a distraction. The real threat could bypass their multi-billion ruble air defenses as if they were not there. It meant a precision first strike targeting their nuclear silos, their command bunkers, and their leadership could be launched at any time from any direction with 0 warning. The entire doctrine of mutually assured destruction, the terrifying balance that had kept the world from nuclear annihilation for 4 decades, was predicated on one simple fact. You could see the attack coming. You had time to respond. This phantom, this ghost over Baghdad, had just erased that time. It had erased that certainty. The immediate terrifying conclusion for Moscow was not that their client state was losing a war. It was that their entire empire, their homeland, was as of this night, naked, defenseless. The mystery was absolute. The Americans were bombing a capital city. And as far as the world's most advanced radar network was concerned, they were doing it with nothing at all. The hunt for this phantom, this object, Nevidimka, invisible object, became the most desperate technological priority in the dying days of the Soviet Union. They had to find out what it was, and they had to find a way to kill it. The Kremlin was in a state of controlled panic. The nightly reports from Baghdad were not just reports of a military collapse. They were a catalog of impossibilities. The coded telexes sent from the Soviet embassy were read by Mikhail Gorbachev himself, and their implications were chilling. The first most urgent directive went out from the General Staff to the Glavnoy Razvedvalyra, the GRU military intelligence. Forget the political situation in Iraq. That was a lost cause. The new overriding priority was a single desperate question. What is this weapon? A special commission for anomaly analysis was hastily assembled at the PVO headquarters in Zaria, outside Moscow. It was a grim gathering of the Soviet Union's best minds in radar theory, electronic warfare, and aerospace engineering. They were locked in a conference room and presented with the raw data from Baghdad, the radar logs, the after-action reports from Surov and his team, and the satellite reconnaissance imagery. The room was defined by a single glaring contradiction. The satellite photos showed surgical destruction, bunker, busting bomb impacts on hardened targets, while the radar logs showed nothing. The investigation began. The first theory was simple: catastrophic failure of their own equipment. The French electronics and the carry system must be compromised, one general declared, slamming his fist on the table. This is a Western backdoor, a kill switch. It was a comforting thought. It implied their Soviet technology, the PVO systems back home, was still secure. Teams were dispatched to Soviet air defense batteries along the East German border, ordering them to run diagnostics to scan for any sign of this electronic virus. They found nothing. The systems were clean, fully operational. Then the focus shifted to the operators. The Iraqis were incompetent, a PVO colonel argued. They were poorly trained. They panicked. They failed to follow doctrine. Colonel Surov recalled to Moscow and debriefed. In a windowless room, for 72 straight hours vehemently refuted this. You are missing the point, he insisted, his voice roar with fatigue. There was no signal to miss. There was no blip to track. I was there. I watched the scopes myself. The sky was clean. The system was operating perfectly. It was reporting the truth. And the truth it reported was that nothing was there. This admission that their own perfect system had reported an impossibility was the most terrifying conclusion of all. It meant the failure was not in the software, not in the operators, but in the physics on which their entire defense was built. The Commission was forced to look elsewhere. The GRU activated its entire network of agents and assets inside NATO. They were ordered to drop all other surveillance and focus on a single hunt. They were looking for manifests, for pilot rosters, for supply requisitions, anything that pointed to a new secret. Aircraft. They were told to listen for bar talk near American air bases in Turkey, in Saudi Arabia, in Germany. The pilots, they reasoned, must be talking. Someone must know. But the American military, in the wake of the Vietnam War, had achieved a new level of operational security. The GRU agents came back with nothing. They heard rumors of the B-2 bomber, the massive flying wing, but the intelligence suggested it was still in development. Years from service. They heard whispers of a fast-moving reconnaissance plane, the Aurora, but that was hypersonic, a high-altitude screamer. This thing over Baghdad was different. It was low. It was slow. It was precise. The legend of the Nevimka, the invisible one, began to grow inside the Soviet military. It became the ultimate bogeyman. Air defense pilots flying MiG-29s and the new powerful Su-27s began reporting anomalies on the very edges of their radar screens near sensitive airspace over the Barents Sea or the Sea of Japan. They would catch a ghost, a signal that would appear for a single sweep of the radar only to vanish instantly, not fade as a normal aircraft would at extreme range, just gone. Was it a weather anomaly? A flock of birds, or was it probing them? A report from a captain in a PVO radar station in Siberia became infamous. He claimed that for 3 nights in a row at precisely 2 to 100 hours, a radar transparent hole appeared to move across his sector. He described it as watching a black spot move across a green screen, an area where the normal background clutter of the atmosphere simply ceased to exist. He was reprimanded for drunkenness and hysterical reporting. but his report was quietly flagged and sent to the Special Commission. The wrong conclusions began to solidify, driven by a desperate need to fit this anomaly into a reality they could understand. The first major theory was plasma stealth. The Commission's physicists proposed that the Americans had somehow weaponized Soviet research from the 1960s. The idea was that an aircraft could generate a cloud of ionized gas or plasma around its fuselage. This plasma field would absorb radar waves, rendering the aircraft invisible. This theory gained traction. It was exotic. It was scientifically plausible on paper, and most importantly, it acknowledged a Soviet origin which was politically palatable. The problem was the power required to generate such a field would require a small nuclear reactor on board the plane. It seemed impossible, but was it? The second, more desperate theory was active cancellation. This was the idea of a hyper-advanced electronic warfare craft. This aircraft wouldn't just jam radar. It would catch the incoming radar pulse, analyze it in a nancon, and send back an identical, perfectly out off-phase signal. The two signals, the original reflection and the anti-signal, would cancel each other out, resulting in zero return on the radar scope. This theory was in some ways even more terrifying. It implied the Americans possessed computing power so far beyond Soviet estimates that the gap was no longer a gap but a chasm. It meant the Novimka was not just an aircraft but a flying supercomputer. A vast panicked effort began. Engineers at the NPO Vimpla Design Bureau were ordered to develop new missile systems. If we cannot see it, we must hear it. One directive read. Work was accelerated on acoustic sensors, massive arrays of microphones, designed to listen for the unique engine signature of this phantom plane. Radar designers at NIP, the Tikhonov Scientific Research Institute of Instrument Design, were ordered to scrap their current projects and focus on counter-stealth. They began experimenting with new types of radar, low-frequency meter-wave radars, which the P-18 Spoon Rest used, were thought to be a potential solution. Their long wavelengths, it was theorized, might be able to resonate with the fuselage of the aircraft, creating a detectable signal. But these were all just theories. They were the desperate flailing of an investigation that had hit a brick wall. While the engineers hunted for a counter, the Soviet leadership was paralyzed. They had no idea what this thing was, how many there were, or where it was based. They only knew that their multi-trillion ruble air defense shield, the centerpiece of their national security for half a century, was now functionally obsolete. A relic, imagine. The ghost over Baghdad had done more damage to the Soviet psyche than 1,000 nuclear missiles. It proved in the most brutal and undeniable way that the technological race had been lost. The enemy didn't just have a better plane. They had a different kind of plane. They were operating on a level of physics that the Soviet Union could no longer even comprehend, let alone match. The hunt for answers had only deepened. The mystery, and with it, the paranoia and the dawning horrifying realization that the game was over. While the finest minds in the Soviet PVO chased plasma theories and acoustic phantoms, the answer to the mystery was flying every night in the one place on Earth they could never look, the empty high desert of Nevada. The source was not a team of scientists. It was a cult. They operated from a dry lake bed known to map makers as Groom Lake, but known to its inhabitants only as the Ranch. This was United States Air Force Plant 402, a place that did not officially exist. It was the heart of the Lougheed Advanced Development Projects Division, universally known as the Skunk Works. The Skunk Works was not a normal aerospace contractor. It was a legend, a black-budget kingdom, forged by the mind of Clarence Kelly Johnson, the man who had built the U-2 spy plane and the SR-71 Blackbird. His successor, Ben Rich, inherited Johnson's core philosophy: a tiny, brilliant team, absolute secrecy, and a complete intolerance for bureaucracy. They were aerospace pirates, given impossible problems and left alone to solve them. And in the mid-1970s, the problem was singular: defeat the wall. The wall was the very same integrated air defense system that Surov had watched fail in Baghdad. After the 1973 Yamapur War, where Soviet-supplied SA-6 missiles had decimated the Israeli Air Force in a matter of days, the Pentagon was horrified. They realized their entire air strategy fast. High-altitude bombing was obsolete. The Soviet PVO network with its overlapping radars and multi-layered missiles was impenetrable. Sending a B-52 or an F-111 against that wall was a suicide mission. The American military had hit a technological dead end. DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, put out a quiet, desperate call. They didn't just want a plane that was harder to see. They wanted a plane that was invisible. The story of the solution begins not in an American lab, but in a Moscow library. In 1962, a brilliant but obscure Soviet physicist named Pato Yefimtsev published a paper titled Method of Edge Waves in the Physical Theory of Diffraction. The paper was highly theoretical, a dense thicket of equations. It argued that the radar reflection of an object was not determined by its size, but by the arrangement of its edges. Sev's bosses in the Soviet Union saw no practical military application for his work. They deemed it academically interesting but useless, and critically they did not classify it. It was translated and published openly. A decade later, an analyst at the Skunk Works Denny's Overhauls found paper. He wasn't an aerodynamicist. He was a radar specialist. He and a computer expert, Bill Schroeder, fed Yefim's equations into their computers. What they discovered was the key to the kingdom. The equations proved that a curved aerodynamic shape like every aircraft ever built was actually a perfect radar reflector. Its smooth, rounded surfaces acted like a curved mirror, scattering radar energy in thousands of directions with a significant amount bouncing directly back to the radar receiver. But Yefimov's math showed a different path. A shape made of flat triangular panels. Facets would act like a shattered mirror. If angled correctly, these panels would not absorb the radar waves, but deflect them away from the receiver in a few narrow beams. From the front, an aircraft built this way would not look like a B-52, which had a radar cross-section, RCS, of a flying barn. It wouldn't even look like a small bird. If the angles were perfect, it would have the radar cross-section of a steel, marble or less. Overhalser and Skrida developed a computer program based on this concept code named Echo 1. They used it to design a shape. The result was grotesque. It was a pyramid of sharp, triangular planes. It looked like something a child would fold from paper. The engineers called it the hopeless diamond. They took a wooden mock-up, stuck it on a pole, and pointed a radar at it. The radar operator thought his equipment was broken. The signal just vanished. The hopeless diamond had a radar return that was 1,000 times smaller than any aircraft in history. They had done it. They had designed an invisible airplane. There was only one problem, and it was a fatal one. The hopeless diamond could not fly. It was by every known law of aerodynamics inherently unstable. The same flat panels and sharp edges that made it invisible to radar also made it impossible for air to flow over it smoothly. It would tumble out of the sky like a brick. This is where American ingenuity became dominance. The Skunk Works team realized the solution was not in the airframe, but in the computer. At the same time, the Air Force was pioneering a radical new technology, fly-by-wire. They had built an experimental F-16 that had no direct mechanical linkage between the pilot's stick and the control surfaces. The Pilots' inputs went to a computer, and the computer flew the plane. The Skunk Works team saw the opportunity. What if they used this system not just to fly a stable plane, but to tame an unstable one? They pitched the concept to Ben Rich. They would build the hopeless diamond, and they would link its control surfaces to a set of quadruply redundant digital flight computers. The plane would be permanently actively stalling. The computers, sensing its chaotic lurching, would make thousands of micro adjustments every second to its wings and tail, catching it, rebalancing it, and tricking it into flying straight. The pilot would not be flying the aircraft in a conventional sense. They would merely be aiming it, telling the computers where they wanted to go. The computers would handle the impossible physics of keeping it in the air. This was the leap. The F-117 Nighthawk was born not just from a breakthrough in radar theory, but from a breakthrough in computing. It was the fusion of atoms, equations, and the processing power of the microchip. The project code named Havel Blue, and then Senior Trend was buried deep inside Groom Lake. The secrecy was absolute. The pilots, handpicked, became night flyers. They were forbidden from flying during the day when Soviet reconnaissance satellites passed overhead. But even if a satellite had caught a glimpse, what would it have seen? A bizarre black, bug-like shape. It had no radar on board. It would be a beacon. It received all its targeting data from other platforms. Its engine intakes were covered by fine-grained screens to hide the fan blades from radar. Its exhausts were flattened into long, thin platypus slits, mixing the hot gas with cold air to create a plume that was almost invisible to infrared sensors. Its skin was coated in a secret radar absorbent material, RAM, that soaked up any stray radar waves the facets couldn't deflect. For almost 10 years, from its first flight in 1981, the F-17 was a complete unknown. It was an unperson in the military budget. The pilots flew, practiced, and perfected their tactics. In total isolation, they developed the G-suit and a briefcase routine, flying their missions at night and disappearing into bland, anonymous contractor offices during the day. While Soviet intelligence hunted for a plasmash-shielded superplane, the Americans were quietly building a fleet of unplans, flying computers whose very existence was a paradox. They weren't just ahead of the Soviets. They were on a different technological axis altogether. The Soviets were trying to build a better shield. The Skunk Works had built a key. And on January 17, 1991, they finally put that key in the lock. The investigation in Moscow was not just a failure. It was a humiliation. The GRU had been chasing phantoms, plasma shields, active cancellation, flying saucers. The truth, when it finally came, was not uncovered by a master spy. It was not stolen in a daring midnight raid. It was handed to them on November 10, 1988, over 2 years before the bombing of Baghdad. The Pentagon held a press conference. Assistant Secretary of Defense, J. Daniel Howard, stepped up to a podium and read a dry single-paragraph statement. The United States Air Force, he admitted, had developed and fielded a stealth aircraft. He gave its designation F-17A. He then held up a single heavily doctored grainy photograph. In a secure room at the GRU headquarters, a team of analysts pinned this photo to a board. They stared at it in stunned, horrified silence. The object in the picture was not a sleek, futuristic marvel. It was a monster, a black, angular, nightmarish collection of flat triangles. It looked less like an airplane and more like a piece of abstract sculpture. It looked impossible. This was the shock moment. This was the reveal. The paranoia of the past decade, the ghost signals, the pilot's anomalous reports, the hopeless diamond theory, all crystallized into a single horrifying reality. The Americans had actually built it. The analysts at the Special Commission felt a cold, professional dread. They immediately pulled Peru Fims's 1962 paper from the archives. They laid his equations, which had been dismissed as an academic curiosity, next to the photograph of the F-17. They were a perfect match. The shock was not just that the Americans had a new plane. The shock was that they had built it using Soviet theory. They had taken a concept that Soviet engineers had deemed a useless aerodynamic dead end and solved it. How? The answer was a word that haunted the Soviet military-industrial complex: computing. Soviet aerospace design was brilliant, but it was analog. Their planes were built to be inherently stable, to be flown by a human. The F-17 was not. It was a fly-by-wire machine. It was a flying computer. The analysts realized the Americans had not just built a stealth airframe. They had created a digital brain smart enough to tame an object that by all rights should never have left the ground. The technological gap was no longer a gap. It was a chasm. The Americans were not just playing the same game better. They were playing a different game entirely. And in January 1991, when this thing appeared over Baghdad, all of Moscow's worst fears were confirmed. The grainy photo was now a combat-proven weapon, and it rendered their entire air defense doctrine worthless. The Soviet response was a desperate, panicked scramble. The Neverdima was no longer a mystery, but a known quantity. Now they had to find a way to kill it. The entire PVO was retasked. The first and most logical attempt was to go back to old technology. They focused on their long-wave meter-band radars like the P-18. Spoon rest the very systems that had been in Baghdad. The theory was sound. The F-17's facets were designed to deflect high-frequency fire control radar waves, the short centimeter-sized waves, needed for missile guidance. But the long meter-sized waves of the P-18 were different. They were physically too large to be neatly deflected by the plane's small facets. Instead, they would resonate with the entire airframe, particularly the tail fins and the wing tips. This produced a result, but it was a useless one. A P-8 operator wouldn't see a blip. They would see a faint shimmering area of probability. They could tell that something stealthy was in a 50 kilometers wide box of sky, but they couldn't track it. They couldn't get its speed, its altitude, or its precise heading. It was the electronic equivalent of hearing a floorboard creak. In a dark house, you knew someone was inside, but you had no idea where, and you couldn't possibly aim a weapon. 2. Shoot. The PVO needed to hand off the target to a high-frequency engagement radar, like the fan song for the SA-2 missile. And the instant that sharp centimeter-band radar lit up the sky, its waves would hit the F-17's facets and be deflected. The plane would vanish from the scope. The Soviets were trapped in a physics nightmare. Their long-range radar could see a ghost, but their short-range radar, the killer, was blind. The next futile attempt was to try and brute force the problem. The engineers at Mikoyan and Fazatron were ordered to accelerate the development of the MiG-31 Foxhound. This interceptor was a beast built for one purpose: to stop American cruise, missiles, and bombers. Its Zaslin radar was the first phased array radar on a fighter jet. A monstrously powerful system that could blast colossal amounts of radar energy into the sky. The hope was burned through. They believed that if they pumped enough energy at the F-17, even a microscopic 0.001% reflection would be detectable. It was a failure. The F-17's radar cross-section, the size of steel marble, was simply too small. The Zaslin's powerful beam would hit it and scatter. The tiny return lost in the massive noise of the background clutter. It was like trying to find a single black pearl on a black sand beach by using a floodlight from a mile away. The Soviet Union's most brilliant engineers, its most advanced interceptors, and its most powerful radars were all rendered impotent. They knew exactly what the F-17 was. They knew how it worked down to the very equations, their own, that had created it, and they could not do a single thing about it. The ghost over Baghdad had a name, but knowing its name only confirmed that it was, for all practical purposes, invincible. The first Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm, lasted just 43 days. But for the Soviet General Staff, the war was over in the first 43 minutes. The F-17's performance was not just a success. It was a statistical annihilation, a final verdict on 40 years of Cold War technological competition. Here is the killer statistic, the number that formalized the end of an empire. During the entire conflict, the Iraqi Air Defense Network, guided by Soviet doctrine and equipped with thousands of Soviet-made surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft guns, fired an estimated 6,000 missiles at coalition aircraft. The number of F-17 Nighthawks hit by those missiles was 0. Not one was struck. Not one was damaged. Not one was lost to enemy action. This fleet of unflyable jets, operating with impunity in the most heavily defended airspace on the planet, flew 1,271 sorties. They struck 31% of all strategic targets on the first day. Over the course of the war, this small force of just 42 aircraft, representing only 2.5% of the total Allied air fleet, was responsible for destroying 40% of Iraq's entire strategic target list. They hit hardened command bunkers. They hit nuclear and chemical weapons facilities. They hit telecommunications hubs. They hit the bridges, the air defense centers, and the power grid. They were the silver bullet that blinded and paralyzed the entire Iraqi state before the ground war even began. The F-17 was not just a plane. It was a force multiplier. It was the physical manifestation of American dominance. For the leadership in Moscow, this was the final brutal lesson. The Cold War had never truly been about the number of tanks in East Germany or the number of warheads in a silo. It was a war of systems, a war of economics, ideas, and ultimately information. The Soviet Union had built its system on imitation and brute force. It was a system that excelled at copying Western technology. The atomic bomb, the jet engine, the microchip, and then mass-producing it. Their doctrine was to overwhelm with numbers. Their PVO air defense shield was the ultimate expression of this. A massive, dense, redundant wall of steel. The American system, forged at places like the Skunk Works, was built on innovation. It didn't try to build a better wall. It tried to find a way to ignore the wall. The F-17 was the ultimate product of that innovative system. It was not a better version of a Soviet plane. It was a new idea. It was the fusion of an obscure Soviet physics, paper, cutting-edge American computation, and a pirate-can-do engineering culture that simply did not exist in the rigid top-down Soviet design bureaus. This single aircraft proved that the Soviet Union's core economic and scientific model had failed. They could copy the B-52. They could steal the plans for the microchip, but they could not copy the system that produced the F-117. They could not manufacture the ingenuity of a Kelly Johnson or a Ben Rich. They could not replicate the creative freedom of the Skunk Works. The invisible bombers over Baghdad did not just destroy Iraqi command centers. They destroyed the last lingering illusion of Soviet technological power. They exposed the rot at the core of the Soviet system, a system that had bankrupted, itself building a shield, only to discover in one terrifying night that the enemy had already invented a ghost that could walk right through it. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 was the political end of the Cold War. But the Flights of an Avimka over Baghdad in 1991 were its technological epitaph. The mystery that began for Colonel Surov in that dark, vibrating bunker was never really about a new weapon. It was about the arrival of a new age. The ghost in his machine was the future arriving, ahead of schedule. And for the Soviet Union, it was a future they would not live to.